Let's review. This truck has been worked on by another shop. They gave up and now it is my turn. It has a constant misfire on number 5 cylinder. No matter what RPM I run this, it misfires constantly on number 5. They've replaced all of the spark plugs and the number 5 fuel injector. A quick test I performed verified good spark from the ignition coil. The other shop thought that this was an engine problem and they did not want to get involved any further. So let's see what we have in the way of data. There are two codes stored, a P0300 and a P0305. My next step was to look at scan data. I wanted to see what the trim for both banks was. I also wanted to look at the oxygen sensor voltages. I thought it was a scan tool problem that only bank 1 had data. Looking at the wiring schematic, I could see that there are only 2 oxygen sensors. Bank 1 sensor 1 is the upstream sensor. Bank 1 sensor 2 is the downstream sensor. There is only one catalyst and the upstream sensor is mounted after the collector tube. This means that fuel trim will be a combined correction for both banks. So let's look at some scan data from the posted capture. We will walk through the screen by moving the measurement cursor. The engine here is not running. The engine was started, and it takes some time for the O2 sensors to heat up and start working. At this point the fuel system is in open loop. After a few minutes, closed loop operation was reached. I raised the engine speed to move things along and take a look at the fuel trim. Bank 1 has a total of about 23% of positive correction. That is huge and seems to indicate that a fuel injector isn't flowing fuel. But remember, the fuel injector was replaced. Now I have moved the cursor to where I let the engine idle. Trim is less positive, but far more positive than it ought to be. Before going any further, I wanted to make sure that neither of the O2 sensors were pegged lean. That wasn't the case. I decided that this wasn't a sensor problem. I had a misfire on a single cylinder, number 5, and it was causing trim to be very positive. This looked like a fuel injector that wasn't flowing fuel. The injector had been replaced, so I thought maybe it was a driver circuit in the ECM or a wiring fault. I hooked up my scope to look at the injector voltage signal from the ECM. Zoomed out. The injector voltage waveform looked normal. It looked like the ECM driver circuit was working properly. I switched to using my amp probe and scope. I found the injector amperage through number 5 was normal. It was about 780 milliamps. It looks like the injector driver circuit is okay. So, should I replace the injector again? Just to make sure I hadn't missed something obvious, I disabled the fuel system and performed a relative compression test. I have an amp probe around the negative battery cable as I cranked the engine over. Remember, this has a constant and hard misfire. The amperage trace did not show any signs of a major engine problem. I also performed a cranking compression test with a pressure transducer. This looks good. Cranking compression is 168 psi and the waveform looks normal. I was sure this needed a fuel injector, but I wanted more proof. I zoomed in on the voltage waveform for number 5. I noticed that there was no sign of pintle movement at all. I was pretty sure this demonstrated that the injector was bad. But I wanted to be even more sure. I know how I can do that. I moved my probe over to the number 1 fuel injector. This one showed a definite sign of pintle movement. I was sure now. This had a bad new injector. I replaced the fuel injector for number 5 and the misfire went away. This truck is fixed. On to the next problem. Thanks for listening.